This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Dahlia Shenlin, speaking to you from New York City today without Gilad Halperin this time. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books, research, other things that we like. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. We're counting on you. This episode is sponsored by the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. It's part of our new series on democracy, populism, and authoritarian trends around the world. For our first guest on the series, I'm very excited to welcome Masha Gessen. Gessen is the author of 10 books, a staff writer at The New Yorker who has written for the New York Review of Books, Harper's, and many other venues about Russia, American politics, authoritarian trends, many other topics. A small sample of her honors include the Guggenheim Fellowship, an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. Gessen is a visiting professor at Amherst College and a New American National Fellow. Two of Gessen's major works are The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin, and the most recent book that we'll discuss in greater depth today, The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, published by Riverhead Books in 2017. Masha Gessen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
For the first question, I want to ask, as you chronicled Russia's long transition from the Soviet Union through Yeltsin in the 1990s through to Putin, you wrestle with the various meanings of the terms totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and you even ask at one point, what should the Russian system be called? The title of the book seems to settle on totalitarianism, but I want to ask you, is that the best term? Are there differences between past and present? Are we still searching for the right language?
So I don't actually think that the Russian system should be called totalitarianism. So there's a long discussion in the book of the term, and that's one of the ways I could tell which of the reviewers read to the middle of the book and which stopped earlier. It's a long book. But chapter 14 is devoted to a discussion of the term. What I ultimately settle on is that the Russian state is best described as a mafia state. But Russian society has reestablished itself as a totalitarian society, has sort of reconstituted itself that way, so that the lived experience of a Russian citizen today is the experience of a totalitarian subject, but in the absence of a totalitarian state.
I want to ask to what extent we have the right language in general for describing the wave of illiberal regimes, authoritarian, proto-authoritarian, from Erdogan to Orban, Putin to Trump. You once called Trump an autocrat. Do you have a language that characterizes all of these, or are they all fundamentally different?
So I tend to use the word autocrat, and I'm really glad it has gotten traction in this country. A lot of people have started using it, I think in part because of the essay that I wrote immediately after the election and talked about autocracy. I think it's more accurate than authoritarianism. So the definition of authoritarianism that I use, which is a little bit different sort of from the lay definition, people often use authoritarianism like it's totalitarianism light. But
as if there's a matter of degrees, like a continuum.
Exactly. Which you can look at it that way because an authoritarian regime can become totalitarian, but most totalitarian regimes were actually established as totalitarian regimes. There was the great twice exiled political scientist Juan Linz, who defined the difference between totalitarianism and authoritarianism. To simplify it greatly, the authoritarian leader wants people to stay at home and tend to their private lives and not pay attention to what the authoritarian group or person are doing with the country. So under authoritarianism, nothing is political. Everything becomes depoliticized. Everything is about money and comfort and sort of transactions. In a totalitarian regime, everything becomes political and private space disappears. The totalitarian leader wants people not in their private homes, not tending to their lives, but out in the public square, demonstrating their support. One of the defining characteristics of a totalitarian society is that it's mobilized, right? And mobilization is at the root of this totalitarian experience.
Which to some extent characterizes Russia during the transitional phase you're talking about.
It certainly characterizes Russia in the last, I'd say, 7 years, especially in the last 5 years since the annexation of Crimea. It's been a truly mobilized society. And Putin's way of asserting power and accumulating power has been through mobilization in these last 5-7 years. Now, Trump, I think, he's an autocrat. meaning, or he's an aspiring autocrat. He wants to rule by decree, right? And so autocrat doesn't make a distinction between whether it's totalitarian or authoritarian or tyrannical.
So autocrat is a catch-all.
It's totally catch-all, yeah. It's just, he wants to be a one-man show. That's definitely true of Trump. On the sort of authoritarian, totalitarian spectrum, I think if he could, he'd be totalitarian. He wants people out in the public square, right? Trump is the president of the endless rally.
He loves those rallies.
He loves those rallies. They are the thing that sort of confers power on him. That's very different from somebody who just wants to sort of plunder and rule in plain sight but in the shadows.
Well, this is interesting because much of your work focuses so deeply on the inner psychology of Putin and, to some extent, Trump. I think that you sort of delve so deeply inside them that I wonder if you sometimes channel them. Do you hear their voices and you kind of think about how they think inside your head?
I actually don't like to think that I channel them or even get inside their heads. I think that the psychology I'm talking about is not inner psychology. It's observed psychology. I don't know what they're thinking. Frankly, I don't want to know what they're thinking. But I think that if we look clearly through a clean pair of glasses, we can gather a lot about patterns and about expressed desires, right? I don't want to talk about desires that haven't been expressed. I don't think that as a journalist I kind of have that right.
But you observe that Putin seems to take action that, one of your interesting examples I thought was interesting, that he likes to amass more power than people think he has and then reveal it in these sort of spectacle-like situations. Is that an example of observed psychology?
Yes, because he does it over and over again. But also, I listen to them carefully. Putin says everything that we need to know about him. It was especially striking early on, when he first came to power, and people were just projecting all sorts of things onto him. Some people believed that he was a democratic reformer. Some people believed that he was economically liberal. Some people believed that he was European and worldly. He was very open about what he was, how he viewed himself, and what his plans were. Nobody wanted to listen to that.
And that's why you say listen to autocrats.
Yeah, believe what the autocrat says.
Well, it's very tempting in this time, in this day and age, to focus on these towering populist figures, these individual strongmen. But your book also goes very deeply into what seems like infinite layers of social and political evolution in the Soviet Union, going back at least from Stalinism through to the present. How much of this illiberal or authoritarian slide can you attribute to an individual strongman, a top-down process, and how much is the result of all these very deep-rooted social and political experiences over the course of the last century?
Well, that's what I'm interested in the most recent book. Putin, I think, makes a couple of appearances, but on the TV screen as observed by the actual characters in the book. My previous book about Russia was about Putin, and I really didn't want to write another book about Putin. I really wanted to write a book about the experience of living through that transition. And the other thing that the book is about is the experience of trying to describe it. Because one of my arguments is that because the Soviet Union destroyed the social sciences and did it quite purposefully, made a concerted effort to do that, it robbed the society of the tools of self-understanding. And without those tools, society can't imagine itself. It can't imagine itself in the past, it can't imagine itself in the present, and it certainly can't imagine itself in the future. So that's why the book is called The Future is History. It's an intellectual history, and it's a human history of the generation that came of age under Putin. They were born in the Soviet Union. They were kids in the 1990s during the most sort of the years of the most radical change. And they became adults and political animals under Putin. To answer your question about how much of what's happened is a function of the totalitarian experience, I think most of it. I mean, Putin is a function of the totalitarian experiment. And so is the rest of the country.
I mean, I felt very vindicated reading that because I'm also a social scientist, so now I feel like I have justification. What do you think it did, if you can try to characterize it a little bit more, to that generation of people who were born after all these decades of, not just 1 year or 2 years, but decades of people not being able to have the language to describe and understand themselves? Does it mean that they kind of came of age in a sort of sociological void of not being able to know what's happening? What does that do?
Yes, exactly. Sociological void is a great term. I mean, I have one of my favorite tragic episodes in the book is actually something experienced by somebody from a somewhat older generation, the psychoanalyst in the book, Marina Arotunyan. So the book basically follows 7 people, 4 from the younger generation and 3 intellectuals from older generations. They're from different generations. A philosopher, a sociologist, and a psychoanalyst. So the psychoanalyst, she I think she's around 60 now. So she was a grown-up by the time the Soviet Union collapsed. She had studied psychology. She had even practiced psychology a little bit to the extent that she was allowed. And then once things opened up, she started studying psychoanalysis and became a practicing psychoanalyst and went through analysis, as is necessary for psychoanalysts.
Where she was at a great disadvantage in the beginning because she hadn't done that process before.
Exactly. And that was just one of the disadvantages. But by the mid-1990s, she was a practicing psychoanalyst and probably the most experienced one in Russia. And she went to a school organized by a bunch of Western psychoanalysts for psychoanalysts from countries where the psychoanalytic tradition had been broken. And little known fact, psychoanalysis was actually thriving in Russia before the revolution. It was one of the hotbeds of psychoanalysis. Several of Freud's direct students were Russian. And she goes to this school, and part of the training is observing a Western psychoanalyst do his thing. And she observed him, and she realized that he was so much better than she was. And the thing that was really painful for her was that it wasn't because he was more intelligent than she was, or more talented, or more sensitive, or more insightful. It was that, as she saw it, he stood on the shoulders of his predecessors, who stood on the shoulders of his predecessors, who stood on the shoulders of giants. And she stood on nothing. And that sense of emptiness under your feet, I think, is very strong for Russian intellectuals, for the most enterprising Russian intellectuals, right? I'm not talking about people who haven't even engaged in the search. I'm talking about people who are actually reaching and trying to formulate and trying to find language and trying to engage in some sort of conversation about country and society and state.
One of the other characters I found fascinating that took quite a different direction is the character of Alexander Dugin, who it seems like a direct outgrowth of the situation. He had all this time on his hands in the Soviet Union to read. He had an insatiable mind, but without those frameworks, he was kind of left to his own devices to come up with some strange theories all on his own afterwards. What happened to him?
Alexander Dugin is the only one of the 7 main characters in the book who didn't talk to me. But he sent someone to talk to me. He wouldn't talk to me because we have different political and philosophical views. Irreconcilable. Which was funny. I would talk to his assistant, and I would say, what, is he afraid to talk to me? Doesn't he want to argue? But no, he wouldn't talk to me. But he sent her, his right-hand woman. But I also interviewed at length his ex-wife that he lived with in the 1980s. And that was great because she is still a big admirer of his and a friend. And she described his intellectual education, his self-education. And one of my favorite scenes was when he got hold of Being in Time, Martin Heidegger. But he got hold of it on microfilm. And of course, he didn't have a microfilm machine. So he rigged up this children's diafilm machine. Diafilm is how my parents used to show me cartoons, right? It's like this hand-cranked thing that you project onto a sheet on a wall. So he projected it on his desktop. But my assumption is that if he was using a diafilm machine to project microfilm, he was reading backwards.
You mean letters? I mean, how can you read letters? But we had to actually... Oh, this reminds me of Jewish students in the traditional cheder who would sit opposite one another and read the text, the Talmud, upside down, because one of them would hold the page and the other one would read it upside down.
Well, there you go. It's a very important skill for reporters to have when you're in somebody's office and you're interviewing somebody and they have something sitting in front of you. It is important to be able to read it.
Equipment.
As a reporter, you don't usually have fancy spy equipment. You have your own eyes. So he read this on a dark desktop backwards, lost his eyesight in the process. I mean, he didn't go completely blind, but he really damaged his eyes, which is kind of the perfect metaphor, I think, for the way that he was introduced to the Western philosophic tradition, without the framework, without sort of the necessary background, without language. He learned each language in order to read a book. The guy is clearly very talented, but so he learned German in order to read Heidegger in the original. But how do you do that? How do you read in a foreign language out of context after having taught yourself the language? So in a sense, it's not terribly surprising that he then really went off the deep end. And
what does that mean? How did he go off the deep end?
So he's become a traditionalist with a capital T in the tradition of Julius Evola. And it's weird, these weird parallels. He reads the same stuff that Steve Bannon reads, which I would have spent a little bit more time on this in the book had I known what was coming in this country. But I thought this was really, it seemed very exotic information for me. So I summarized it in the book in maybe a paragraph or two. When actually the parallels are quite interesting.
We'll talk about them. I mean, I want to ask about your choice of those characters. These are individuals who went through their processes. Did you choose them because you think that in a way they are a metaphor or representative of the general Russian society, or do they stand apart?
I don't believe in the representative school of journalism. I think that it's much better to think of you always make choices, right? You make choices about who you interview, you make choices about who the characters are in a book, and in a book like this, they're characters, right? Even though it's completely documentary and every word is based on interviews or on written text. But you still make choices in the way that you construct a narrative. And I think that claiming to choose characters because they're somehow representative of a larger group is disingenuous and also not terribly interesting. I like to think of it as illuminating. Right? There's a particular phenomenon, there's a particular place, there's a particular moment that I want to shine light on. And so I find people who will be my source of light.
A window into that mentality.
It's a window, it's a kind of optics, right? The sociologist and the psychoanalyst, and to a lesser extent, Dugin the philosopher, they provided me with stories and insights about moments and events and places, but they also told me the stories of their disciplines, which are very much a part of the story.
Right. I want to go to some of these comparisons. One of the comparisons that stood out to me was what you characterize in the 1990s as a sort of element of longing, in a way, for the past, the structure, even the common suffering. I see, of course, lateral parallels in places like, former Yugoslavia and Yugo-nostalgia, and then also ancient historic parallels, the Israelites, crying out again to be slaves in Egypt. Was it a matter of nostalgia for the lost structure, fear of the uncertain? And does this prime the ground for the future, the coming sense of authoritarianism?
Right. So the model that I use to talk about that in the book is actually Erich Fromm's model. He's the great German social psychologist who I've been surprised, actually, because since Trump was elected, there are a couple of books that have have shot up to the top of the bestseller list, including The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, which of course is a great book, but it's very, very difficult to read. Whereas Erich Fromm's book has not somehow been reintroduced, even though I've been trying to popularize it every time I speak. But it's actually a really easy read. It's a delightful read. It was published in 1940, and there is an introduction in which he apologizes for the writing being a little sloppy because he wrote it in a hurry because he thought the world was on the verge of catastrophe. That's an amazing thing to read.
He wasn't wrong.
Yeah, he was clearly right, and that gives the book a lot of credibility. So he was writing about Hitler's rise to power, and the book is called Escape from Freedom. And his model is that there are two kinds of freedom. There's freedom from, which we all want. We all want our parents to stop telling us what to do, and there's freedom to, which is trickier. It's the freedom of uncertainty. It's the freedom to invent yourself. It's the freedom to figure out who and where and how and when you will be.
These kind of overlap with negative and positive rights, right, Isaiah Berlin?
Yes, they do overlap with negative and positive rights. I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, no, absolutely. But so his hypothesis is that for a lot of people, this freedom to can be an unbearable burden. When you really don't know, when you can't see a year 10 years, 15 years ahead without dread, or even when you just can't see, that can be unbearable for all but a small minority of people for whom self-invention is exhilarating. And so he suggests that there are certain moments in human history when uncertainty is so great that a critical mass of people want to cede their agency, want to find somebody, what he calls a magic helper, who will take their agency in exchange for the promise of predictability and certainty. Arendt writes about the same thing in a much more complicated way, right? But her Origins of Totalitarianism suggests that there are certain preconditions of totalitarianism, and they include mass displacement of people. That's what she mostly focuses on. To a lesser extent, economic instability, to a lesser extent in her writing. And she also talks about imperialism as a precondition, anti-Semitism as a precondition. And then she also talks about the promise of stability that totalitarianism offers, right? So these are they're parallel lines of logic. But that desire to go back to the imaginary past, and again, imaginary past is Fromm's term. He diagnosed that very precisely, right? That's something that we have seen over and over again at moments when the uncertainty and instability and unrootedness, or again, what Arendt calls homelessness on an unprecedented scale, rootlessness to an unprecedented depth.
And I can't help but linking it to the question of happiness. One of the interesting public opinion studies you cite, among many, thankfully, because I like public opinion research, from 1999 showed that 58% of people said they would like to return to pre-perestroika days. This reminds me a lot of the studies showing that in the post-feminist era, women are not as happy as they were. Is there an overlap there with people simply not only fearing freedom, but actually not necessarily being happier because of freedom? Especially as in Russia, as you point out, people experience the inequalities between them and one another and other countries.
So the question of inequality, this is actually, I suspect, for on a scale of novelty in the book. This should be the most interesting thing to a lot of people in the book, is my discussion of class structure in Soviet society, because I think it's the least known.
I thought it was fascinating.
Well, it's the least known, right? It's the thing, like everybody assumes that there was no class in Soviet society. In fact, it was the most rigidly class-based society in history.
You have children who grew up never seeing somebody outside of their own social class.
You have children, and social class is defined extremely narrowly, right?
And zero social mobility. Sorry for interrupting.
Zero social mobility, zero geographic mobility. So, in a sense, it's like this feudal society where you're born into a trade and onto a street where you're going to live the rest of your life. But it has the appearance of a modern society. But there was a structure that went from the military and the party elite at the top down through the Academy of Sciences, the creative classes, the technical intelligentsia, manual labor, unskilled labor, and down to the peasantry. And the classifications were incredibly precise, down to the height of the ceiling that you would have in your apartment, depending on whether that apartment was built for a writer or an engineer or a manual laborer, and the materials used in building, and so on and so forth. So part of what happened, and people tend to talk about the 90s as a period of growing inequality, which is true to an extent. But what's really important is that inequality was exposed. So people lived without seeing difference, and that difference gave them the illusion of being equal to others, but also the illusion of predictability. And then predictability and that sense of being safely cloistered, both are taken away at the same time. They see how others live. They're confronted
including
with
abroad.
Right? Including abroad. There's an interesting idea that, and this was a surprise to me, when Lev Gutkov, the sociologist, in a book, he talks about the importance of some people traveling abroad in the 90s and seeing that people, even in poor European countries, like a country like Spain, people who weren't particularly rich lived better than people who considered themselves well off in the Soviet Union. And that was a shock. And it was a very humiliating shock. And so when we talk about, the politics of resentment that is so central to Russia's sense of self, especially in the early 2000s, Like all of that is in play. Because what's lost is a sense of belonging to a great empire, but also the sense of certainty, but also the sense, you can't unknow the fact that other people live better than you do. But you desperately want to unknow it.
I want to ask about something that moves us ahead into the Putin years. What fascinates me is something that I have a hard time articulating. I call it, for the purposes of this conversation, the authoritarianism that does not necessarily speak its name, because it rests on these instinctive forms of suppression that are below the level of the law. And one scene that I found very poignant is when Seryoza buys a ticket for 60 rides on the Moscow metro and hands them out to passengers because he was fed up with waiting on a long line. And right away, immediately, a policeman apprehends him. He doesn't even know why. The policeman doesn't even know why. Why does this scene terrify me so much?
Well, that is my absolute favorite scene in the book. That was like, when he told me about that, I thought, oh my God, he's just summed up the whole experience.
It's the nut graph of a 600-page book.
It's the nut graph of the 600-page book. It's also, you probably didn't notice, but it's the cover image. That is a lady selling metro tickets.
I wish our listeners could see the image right now.
It's a really bizarre image. And you don't have to know, because the designer of the book found this photo, and I don't think she put two and two together, because it looks like an image of totalitarianism, right?
The person doesn't have a face in the image.
The person's face is obscured by the loudspeaker that's built into the booth where she's sitting. So some people think she looks like a deep sea diver in one of those old suits. But yeah, she looks like she instead of a face, she has a loudspeaker. But she's also selling metro tickets. And the story is that Seryoza, a young man, one of the four young characters, so he's quite young. He's actually living outside of Russia. He's living temporarily in Kiev, but he comes back to Moscow for a presidential election in 2008, which of course is a sham election. But the way he was brought up in a very political, very powerful family. He is the grandson of the intellectual author of Perestroika, and he was taught that voting is extremely important. So he flies back to Moscow just to cast his vote. And he takes the bus from the airport to the metro station, and there's a huge line because all these people have taken the bus from the airport to the metro station. None of them have tickets. The system is kind of like the system in New York. You buy a single ride or a multi-ride ticket. And most people entering have a ticket, so most stations are not such a nightmare, but this particular station at the end of the line near the airport is a total nightmare. So he spends an hour in this miserable line. And by the time he makes it to the front of the line, he has an idea. So he buys a 60-ride ticket. And he makes an announcement. He says, I've just bought this 60-ride ticket. I have just spent an hour standing in this line. You people are tired. I don't want you to spend an hour standing in this line. Go ahead, I'll swipe you through. And he hasn't done anything that's illegal on the face of it. He has paid full price for this ticket, and he just wants to let people ride without standing in line. It doesn't occur to him for a second that he's doing anything wrong. But a policeman immediately appears next to him and hauls him into the police station or the police, outpost at the metro station, where he has this surreal conversation where he gets yelled at, and then ultimately he's talking to this policeman, and the policeman says, you could have landed the cashier, the ticket saleswoman in jail, and the theater says, no, I couldn't have. All I did was buy tickets. She wasn't doing anything wrong. But the resale of tickets is forbidden, but I wasn't reselling tickets. I just bought the ticket and was swiping people through. And finally, the policeman says, what do you think you are, God? And at this point, Seryoza has this strange sense of calm descend on him because he realizes that they live in different universes. And he will never be able to explain to this policeman how he's thinking, and the policeman will never be able to will never be able to verbalize how he thinks.
I found this so striking that I actually quoted the way you put it, which was that he says to himself, this man's mind works in a way I will never be able to understand. And that made me really want to know, does the policeman and the society he represents, are they beyond reach? Are we talking about two different Homo Sovieticus versus Homo something else that will never be able to coexist?
So the technical answer to that question is, we have no idea.
That's a very honest answer.
Right? No, because this kind of person, Right, and I want to make it very clear that when I use the term Homo Sovieticus, I'm not using it in some sort of essentializing, the Russian national character way. That's ridiculous.
I don't think anybody could possibly take that out of your book because you analyze the political processes that lead to it.
Right, but when people hear the term, they sometimes react to it as an essentialist and even racist term, which it isn't. It's a sociological term, and it's the idea that there is a certain set of adaptations that were required to live in a totalitarian society. And that the most important of those adaptations was doublethink. And as Orwell wrote, even to understand doublethink requires the use of doublethink. But it's basically this ability to think entirely contradictory things at the same time. Without, and this is important because we all can think contradictory things at the same time, but we're bothered by it. We have a deep desire to reconcile them. But a person under totalitarianism gets fragmented to such an extent that they can think entirely contradictory things and perform entirely contradictory persons without feeling inner conflict. This is where it connects to trauma, and we know that the same thing happens to women victims of human trafficking. They fragment in order to survive because their reality is so unpredictable, because they can't plan for the future, because they have no agency in their own lives. They just perform in response to whatever is happening at a given moment. Now, Arendt, when she was writing about totalitarianism, I think one of her most important insights is that the difference between totalitarianism and tyranny, and this is why I insist on very precise terminology, right? Because that distinction is huge. The difference between totalitarianism and tyranny is that tyranny demands behaviors and even statements, but it doesn't aim to take over a person's very being. It actually leaves people a little bit of private space. And within that private space, human relationships happen, and humans exist as their selves. Totalitarianism robs people of the very ability to form convictions. And so even when you do public opinion research, you can't do it in a totalitarian society because there's no public and there's no opinion. Because people will perform the opinion that they think is expected of them. Because that is a way to survive in a totalitarian society. But surviving in a totalitarian society means actually sacrificing yourself, right? So the question you're asking is, once people have been hollowed out to such an extent over generations, can that ever change? And the answer is we don't know because that experiment hasn't happened before.
One of the things that I think is so characteristic of any of these regimes is the control of information, right? This has to do with what we're talking about. And again, you describe so poignantly the earlier years during the 20th century of total information control. But we also know that people like Dugin did manage to dig up pages of Heidegger and found ways to read them. We also know my favorite example of rock and roll records pressed into the discarded X-rays. And, people find information when they want it. In this day and age, now, when we have more channels for information than ever before, are we at an advantage, or is the Putin regime or authoritarian regimes like that able to simply use those channels to constantly scramble our information and confuse us?
So I think there are a lot of questions here. One is, under totalitarianism, actual totalitarianism, which is, of course, what's described in the original work on totalitarianism, is the first 30 years of the Soviet Union, the only 12 years of Nazi totalitarianism. The terror has to be total. Every single person has to be afraid every single moment. There has to be a credible threat of violence at all times. Everything needs to be punishable and unpredictably punishable.
And internal enemies.
Well, and internal enemies is part of that. And the most important thing about internal enemies is that you don't know if you are one. That's how terror works, right? There's a recent movie by Sergei Loznitsa, which is found footage. It's footage of the original show trial from 1930 in the Soviet Union. One of the most striking things to me about watching that movie was watching the defendants listen very attentively to the prosecutor to find out what they did. Later totalitarianism, which Václav Havel called post-totalitarianism, but I think it's actually just late-stage totalitarianism, is much more economical. once terror has been established, once it's been totalitarian, they don't actually have to exert total terror, which is very expensive. Right? It can be very selective. It's a system of signaling. And it's still, even if it's highly selective, it still creates that sense of dread because there is the credible threat. In the Soviet Union in the late 70s, in the 80s, the threat was there, but there was a little bit of gray area. So yes, you could read Heidegger on microfilm. You could also go to jail for reading Heidegger on microfilm. It wasn't terribly likely, but it was likely enough that the vast majority of people never would have dared. You had to at least be willing to risk major trouble, right? I mean, and you don't have to go to jail to have the risk. I mean, you certainly were unhireable. People lost their jobs all the time. People lost all kinds of privileges. And in a society of extreme scarcity, most people just wouldn't risk a piece of steak if a piece of steak could be had.
And now, information now? Are we in an advantage or are the regimes at an advantage?
So that making my way to now. So a couple of things have changed. One is that information is distributed through different channels, right? Because one of the ways in which information started reaching people in the 70s, and even a little bit earlier, was through so-called enemy voices. So through Russian language radio services from the United States and European countries. And now that same thing is on the web, right? You can read foreign information on the web. You can also publish to the web, although that's getting more and more difficult. There's a huge difference between radio and web. On the radio, you are exposed to things that you don't know about. On the radio, you get answers to questions that you didn't ask. On the internet, you don't.
Nobody ever corrects you on the internet. Or they do, but it's just an argument, a perspective.
Yeah, everything is equally weighted. It's very hard to venture into a space where you're exposed to something truly new. And the more fragmented the web, and the Russian web is really fragmented, the less likely you are to be exposed to something that's new. So people who know what they're looking for can get information. But this is brilliant because most people don't know what they're looking for, or they're looking for things that only will affirm their views, which is, we know that. We know that we've talked about the filter bubble even in the West on the internet, where there are all sorts of other things that sort of trickle down and bubble up of information, which doesn't happen in Russia because nothing makes it out of the internet into real life, into more traditional media.
You mean we never get clarity on what the facts are?
No, I don't think the problem is with getting clarity on what the facts are. I think the problem is with having your encapsulated reality challenged in any way. Okay. And that doesn't happen.
Right. Okay, I want to ask one last question because we're talking for a long time. I want to go to Israel briefly. You were just there. You visited Israel and Palestine. You wrote about the divided city of Hebron. From two sides of the line, the Palestinian side, you visited with Issa Amro, a well-known activist, and Jewish leaders of Breaking the Silence, Yehuda Shaul, who opposed the occupation. Why did you do this trip?
Well, it's part of research for the book that I'm writing currently, but also the reason actually that I did the two tours side by side, the tours of the occupation, was because I had done the Breaking the Silence tour with Yehuda a number of years ago, and I found it to be a profound, possibly life-changing experience. I'm going to say all the obvious things. I knew about the occupation, but it's one thing to know, and it's another thing to see and to have the experience of, being in the physical space where it's happening and having it shown to you and having it decoded for you. So this time I was going to Palestine to do some reporting, and I was going with my girlfriend, and I said, I want you to go on this tour, which I did a number of years ago, and found it life-changing. And so she said, well, if I'm going to have a bunch of Jews showing me the occupation, I think I need to at least have some Palestinians show me the occupation too. I said, okay, fair enough. So we did the tour side by side. And she had kind of the same reaction as I did years ago, and I had the same reaction all over again. So that's the private answer to why I did it.
When you wrote Two Sides of the Divide, I thought you were going to talk about the settler side. Did you consider seeing or hearing from settlers in Hebron?
If that story had been my primary purpose in going to Hebron, then I would have done that. But the research I was doing was mostly in Palestine, so this was a kind of, let's do this thing, and I'll also write a piece for the New Yorker website.
Okay. Now, I do a lot of work on comparing conflict international cases myself, and I want to know, did you experience what you saw in Hebron as sui generis, as we say, or did anything there remind you of other political situations, conflict, regimes that you have experienced in your extensive and decades of reporting?
No, of course there are things that I had seen elsewhere. I mean, I did a lot of reporting from Kosovo in the 90s before the war. I actually first traveled there in 94 and to write a story about the underground education system in Kosovo.
Which was, of course, how they built their national and state identity.
Well, yeah, which was absolutely extraordinary. But at the time, no one in the West had heard of it. I don't even remember how I first came across it. And, it seemed unreal. There was an entire school system.
An entire parallel state system.
An entire parallel state system that was, that existed under de facto conditions of occupation. Right? So that, I don't want to make direct and facile comparisons, but as a reporter and as a human being, you gather experiences and you use one to understand another. And so Kosovo, I kept flashing back to Kosovo in the 90s when I was in Hebron.
You can never go wrong by making a Balkan comparison with me. Let's hope that, I'm not even sure what we should hope for. Should we hope for anything?
Peace?
Peace. Yes, nobody can disagree with that. Masha Gessen, thank you again for being on our show. Thank you also to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem and Georgia Fascarini, our producers, and to the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for sponsoring this series. Now, a request, many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. We love them. You can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have over 500 interviews. Like us on Facebook. Follow me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.